14-year-old Jason Penna was expecting a relaxing vacation. As his mother told the New York Times on December 17th of 2024, he, his brother, and his father had ventured into Sinaloa, Mexico, with the hopes of visiting their baby cousins. Just 2 days into their vacation, Jason's brother and father were attacked by the Sinaloa cartel. Now Jason is fighting for his life in the hospital, being shot in the head by these cartels. And yet, as the Council on Foreign Relations explained to us 2 weeks ago, this devastation due to Mexican cartels is nothing new. They explained that the Sinaloa and La Zeta cartels in Mexico, the two largest within the country, have been wreaking havoc on the United States for years through an illegal funneling of fentanyl into the country. Recently, under Donald Trump, the United States has said that they want to escalate this, trying to prevent violence by potentially inserting our military. And yet, considering in his book, Narconomics, Dartmouth professor Thomas Whitwire warns us that a conflict between the U.S. military and the Sinaloa cartels would likely kill over 50,000 U.S. service members. It's for all of their sakes we ask today's question. Escalating cartel violence along the U.S.-Mexico border leads to a deadly skirmish between U.S. troops and Mexican security forces, with tensions at an all-time high. Should the U.S. consider military intervention? The answer is no, because it would only exacerbate the crises we see today by first, destroying our economic cooperation with Mexico. Secondly, leading to an immigration crisis, before finally causing the cartels to retaliate. But first, Mexico and the United States have struggled for decades about their relationship, because the drug conflict is nothing new. But on the economic front, we've had a flourishing diplomatic relationship. So the first reason why the United States should not escalate militarily, even if there was a deadly skirmish, is because doing so would destroy our economic cooperation. An article by the Peterson Institute for International Economics explains to us in October that the United States and Mexico have an incredibly interdependent economies. This is because Mexico is the largest importer of United States goods, while the United States relies heavily, to the tune of over $400 billion a year, on Mexican agricultural exports. To put that in context, the United States relies on Mexico for 4% of its GDP, or gross domestic product, per year. That is billions of dollars, which we rely upon. But if the United States were to invade Mexico militarily, that diplomatic cooperation would be destroyed. As the Observatory for Economic Complexities explained about the complex situation in December, if a conflict was to occur, Claudia Sheinbaum, the current president of Mexico, would likely cause an embargo of U.S. goods, barring it from being sold in any Mexican supermarkets or anywhere else. That would cut U.S. imports into the country and cost our economy by over $400 billion. But the problems wouldn't end there, because Mexico would also likely rally Canada, part of the USMCA, a trade organization between the three countries, to also embargo U.S. goods, because they would want a strong ally. That would cost the United States another $300 billion in trade. To put that in context, as an article by the Agricultural Center in Massachusetts explained to us back in September, cost over 4,000 farmers in the United States their jobs. And yet, unfortunately for the United States, our interdependence on Mexico doesn't end there, but spans all the way to our border. So, the second reason which we can see that the United States should not escalate militarily is because it would completely destroy our immigration crisis. As an article by the Institute for Economic Development explained to us back in September, ever since Donald Trump took to his campaign, he's insisted that the United States and Mexico start stepping up their border cooperation. And shockingly, Claudia Sheinbaum has been receptive to these requests. Indeed, she released a statement just 2 weeks ago saying that she was going to allocate over 10,000 Mexican troops to the border, with the hopes of trying to plug the crisis. She also said that she would be willing to cooperate with Donald Trump's deportation plans, which, although devastating, would likely alleviate the border crisis we see today. And yet, if the United States chose to invade militarily, all of that would be destroyed. As the International Crisis Group explained to us this July, once again, it was likely that whatever Mexican president took power, now Claudia Sheinbaum, would likely punish the United States by removing all Mexican troops from the border, causing an immigration crisis as retaliation for the United States invading. Not only would this cause the United States-Mexican border to become porous, likely allowing more than 500,000 immigrants who are currently in Mexico to enter the United States and causing a full-on crisis, but it would also overwhelm our ICE agents and military, creating a crisis we just can't afford. And finally, although many of us hear about drug cartels and their association to fentanyl, the reality is that they're strong paramilitary groups. So the final reason why the United States should not escalate militarily is because doing so would incur the cartel's violence. The Guardian explained to us in 2023 that we have a long history and knowledge of the Sinaloa cartel's capability to inflict chaos on militaries. They pointed to the example of Black Tuesday, a devastating occurrence in 2023 when the Mexican government tried to capture El Chapo's son, the head of the cartel. The Sinaloa cartel retaliated with over 20,000 of its own members attacking the Mexican government, overwhelming the prison with S-24 bombs imported by Russia, and killing over 5,000 Mexican policemen. It's clear they have insane powers. And yes, used against the United States, the situation would become devastating. As the Council on Foreign Relations estimated last May, the United States military, to the tune of our Marine forces, entered the Sinaloa plain. They estimated that they would struggle to get any territory, because not only does the Sinaloa cartel control local governments and police forces, but they would also mobilize all of their troops against the United States. In the best case, we would come back with wounded troops. In the worst, we would see tens of thousands of our servicemen destroyed. We cannot afford that. So when returning back to today's question, escalating cartel violence along the U.S.-Mexico border leads to a deadly skirmish between U.S. troops and Mexican security forces. With tensions at an all-time high, should the U.S. consider military intervention? The answer is no for the sake of our economy, immigration crisis, and finally, the safety of our troops. In the end, while Jason reminds us that the United States cannot stand by with Mexican cartels, invading is not the right choice.
Congrats on a great speech. I just have a few questions. So first, an overarching question. You talk about Claudia Sheinbaum, but does Claudia Sheinbaum support the existence and rampant activity of cartels within Mexico?
Well, that's a really complicated question. Although Claudia Sheinbaum has said that she wants to mobilize the military against cartels, the reality is that reports have shown that much of her government and police force is actually bought off from these cartels. This links back to her ancestor AMLO, who she was his protege. So even though on paper she might say that she wants to mobilize her military, the reality is that oftentimes she will turn a blind eye to these cartels for the benefit of her own government.
So you argue that she wouldn't want to work with the United States military through the Mexican security forces and instead declare it an all-time invasion of Mexico?
Well, I think that it's a nuanced situation. I think that if Claudia Sheinbaum saw her country invaded by the United States, she would have no choice but to counter the United States. Because obviously, when a leader of a country sees their sovereignty threatened, they would have no choice but to denounce it. Because another military would be invading Mexico's borders.
However, your question doesn't talk about an invasion. It talks about military intervention, which could mean working with these troops, correct?
I would push back against that. Military intervention implies that the United States would have to enter Mexico militarily. If the question wanted to suggest cooperation, it would state it like that.
Moving on to your first point. You talk about problems when it comes to economics with Mexico, but considering that Trump is already trying to push tariffs on Mexico, isn't this economic relationship already destroyed?
Well, I wouldn't say it's destroyed. Although Trump's tariffs are devastating, the reality is he's just putting them on auto manufacturing and not on agriculture, which is what the United States imports the most from Mexico. So yes, a complete destruction of the relationship, if there was an invasion, would be far worse than the tariffs we see today.
You also talk about how this could potentially ruin the relationship between the United States and Canada. But
think it's likely that Canada would side with the country that was invaded rather than the United States.
Jumping to your third point, you talk about the fact that people, or rather the cartels, will retaliate. But have the cartels, or rather, have they ever been responsive to actual peace contracts or any negotiations?
Not really, no. Cartels have oftentimes thrived on violence because they realize that any sort of peace negotiations would, in the end, lead to their fentanyl trade being destroyed.
So in that case, considering that thousands of people, including who you mentioned in your introduction, Jason Pena, are dying, is not the only way to go about this through other violence, specifically violence from strong military powers.
That's a good question, and the reality between the situation in Mexico and the United States is untenable. But I'm arguing that invading Mexico would not only likely incur the cartel's wrath, probably by increasing their drug trade to the United States, it would also kill our servicemen. Even though it's an extreme situation and one that likely requires action we're not seeing today, the solution is clearly not military intervention.
Thank you.
Hello, I should be your second speaker, Robert Singh, with MK1000. And for the room, the question is, Al-Shabaab militants launched a large-scale offensive capturing Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. With the Somali government on the verge of collapse, should the African Union deploy more troops? Once again, Al-Shabaab militants launched a large-scale offensive capturing Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. With the Somali government on the verge of collapse, should the African Union deploy more troops?
Nobody else wants to watch it?
I'm giving time to most of this 5,000.
No. Class next week.
When you translate the names of terrorist groups into English, they can be pretty weird. For example, Al-Shabaab literally means the youth in Arabic. Don't let Drake hear about this. But it might be time for Somalia to squabble up. The Georgetown Journal of International Affairs explains on July 17th of last year, the African Union, an intergovernmental organization of African countries, is currently assisting Somalia in repelling Al-Shabaab, an Islamist terrorist group attempting to take control of the country. Currently, they're doing so by means of their African Union Stability and Support Mission in Somalia, known by its acronym, AWESOME. Unfortunately, they're not doing an awesome job, as not only are they outnumbered, but because they consistently failed to make territorial gains for months on end, Al-Shabaab is currently making gains at a faster rate than ever before, with their eyes set on the capital of Mogadishu. And considering that the International Crisis Group explains just last week, Al-Shabaab's goal isn't just to take over the country's capital, but the entire nation. It's imperative that we ask the question. Al-Shabaab militants launch a large-scale offensive, capturing Somalia's capital of Mogadishu. With the Somali government on the verge of collapse, should the African Union deploy more troops? And the answer is yes, because it's imperative to hold onto the last vestiges of Somali stability. First, because it boosts international funding. Second, because it's critical to preventing infiltration into Ethiopia. And finally, because it props up a potential government in exile. In 2017, Al-Shabaab banned plastic bags in territory under its control, arguing that it was a threat to human health. I mean, save the turtles? Unfortunately, the international community is moving at a turtle's pace, which is why the first reason that the African Union should deploy more troops is to secure additional funding. Currently, the AWESOME mission is not very well funded. In fact, the Stimson Center explains just 2 weeks ago, because they're outnumbered by nearly 3,000 troops by Al-Shabaab militants, the international community isn't too keen on funding a program that they believe is doomed to fail. As a result, AWESOME only has about 24% of the international funding that it needs to continue operating. And naturally, if they take over Mogadishu, these prospects will be even That's exactly why it's imperative that AWESOM deploy more troops to Somalia. Indeed, the Institute for the Study of War explains on February 6th of this year, essentially, by deploying additional troops, it signals to the international community that AWESOM is actually committed to fighting al-Shabaab militants. And by deploying more troops, they're more likely to recapture more territory, which is why they're more likely to receive more funding. At the end of the day, the international community has a vested interest in protecting Somalia from al-Shabaab's expansion. But they'll only provide the necessary funds to do so if they believe that it's even possible in the first place. The country of Ethiopia, despite being landlocked, has a navy for some reason. I mean, don't laugh, we have a space force. But the second reason that the African Union should deploy more troops to Somalia is because it will decrease the likelihood of infiltration into Ethiopia. Al-Shabaab has long attempted to infiltrate into neighboring Ethiopia. The International Crisis Group explains just last week. This is essentially because eastern Ethiopia, which borders Somalia, is composed of ethnic Somalis, which is why they've long targeted that region as part of al-Shabaab's campaign. And if they capture Mogadishu, it's likely that they'll be able to dedicate even more resources to attempting to infiltrate Ethiopia, because they'll have more secure control over their home base. That's exactly why more troops must be deployed to the region. And this is something that is remarkably easy to do. Reuters explains on December 24th of last year, Ethiopia is the largest contributor of troops to AWESOM, which would make it far easier for it to immediately deploy troops to the Somali border. By doing so, they'll decrease the likelihood that al-Shabaab even attempts to infiltrate into Somalia, because the Ethiopian military is more well-armed than they are. But more importantly, this is critical to preventing another war on Ethiopian soil, as the last time the Ethiopian federal government battled an ethnic militia within the country, in northern Tigray, over 600,000 civilians in the country died, mostly as a result of famine. Clearly, this isn't just about protecting Somalia. It's about protecting the people in countries around Somalia as well. But the third and final reason as to why AWESOM should deploy additional troops to Somalia is because it would prop up a government in exile. Surprisingly to many Americans, Mogadishu is not the only city in Somalia. The Institute for the Study of War explains on February 6th of this year, while Mogadishu, which is located in central Somalia, is home to al-Shabaab's offensive, they're currently targeting central Somalia, the second largest city in Somalia, Kiswayo, is located farther south. And because of this, it's likely that a government in exile would flee from Mogadishu to Kiswayo if Mogadishu were captured. Obviously, al-Shabaab would set their sights on capturing this city as well, which is why it's imperative that the African Union deploy troops to exactly that region. The Institute for Strategic Studies in Africa explains on August 23rd of last year, the Somali government has already begun talk of establishing a potential government in exile in the event that Mogadishu is captured. But it's highly unlikely that the Somali military would be able to defend it, especially after being weakened by a Mogadishu offensive. That's exactly why additional AWESOM troops would be so critical, because it's essential to propping up this government in exile. And this isn't just important for remaining internationally legitimate. It's also critical to waging a war of attrition against al-Shabaab, as by having a portion of the country under Somali government control, it allows the international community to use weapons like sanctions against al-Shabaab, making it more likely that one day, al-Shabaab finally collapses. From its founding in 2006 until now, al-Shabaab has grown from a ragtag band of militants into one of the most powerful terrorist organizations in the world. And upon returning to the question, al-Shabaab launches a large-scale offensive, capturing Somalia's capital of Mogadishu. Should the African Union deploy more troops? The answer is clearly yes, because it's essential to holding on to the last vestiges of Somali stability. We saw how in 3 key ways. So, while it's clear that the Somali government might be battling terrorist organizations with some unusual names, if the African Union steps up its efforts, they'll be able to defeat al-Shabaab like that.
Robert, as usual, congratulations on the great speech.
Thank you, Daphne.
Can I ask that question again?
Yeah, just 2, 1, 30.
Just an overarching one that they mobilize, oftentimes used to keep peace, but not actually combat al-Shabaab, instead with the goal of protecting civilians?
Well, both goals are actually synonymous because Al-Shabaab targets civilians as well.
Right, but what I'm asking is the African Union troops actually allowed to go into combat with al-Shabaab?
If the question is, are they trying to retake territory from Al-Shabaab, the answer is yes. In fact, that's the main reason that they were deployed. They're not just there to safeguard civilian institutions, they're outright fighting against Al-Shabaab to try to recapture territory.
Well, I'm asking on a technical question, are African Union troops allowed to do this?
Yes.
Okay. And then moving on to your second point. If the government is in peril and al-Shabaab was able to capture Somalia, isn't it true that their forces would actually be spread incredibly thin because they would be trying to keep Mogadishu? What's to say that they would be able to expand to Ethiopia if they were already fighting the African Union to gain control of one city?
Well, here's the thing. Their forces are already currently spread thin right now, but if they successfully capture Mogadishu and are able to hold on to it because the Somali military is so weak, they will eventually turn to try to capture western, or rather eastern Ethiopia. Even if it doesn't happen in 2025, it might happen in 2026 or 2027. And by deploying troops now, it discourages al-Shabaab from trying to do this anytime soon.
Right. You also mentioned that Ethiopia has its own army. If they have the capacity to repel al-Shabaab, what's to say that also will just repel itself because they think that the Ethiopian military can afford to capture it themselves? Something you explained in your first point is likely because they're lazy on funding.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that question.
I'm arguing that won't the African Union not intercede if the Ethiopian military is capable of defending itself?
Well, the Ethiopian military is just one part of the awesome mission. Typically, these countries' militaries provide troops to awesome who then go and fight in Somalia. They are just one part. They're one part of the puzzle. There are other countries that provide additional firepower.
Right, and then moving on to your third point. Your question mandates that Somalia's government is near collapse. What's to say that they could even move to the other city and now be worth defending from the African Union? The question postulates that they're like one push away from being completely destroyed.
One push away from being completely destroyed means that they're currently in exile fighting, trying not to be destroyed completely. That's why they would be in disquiet. They are still on the verge of collapse in that case.
And how would African Union troops actually protect them in the city if we know that al-Shabaab has already seized the capital and likely destroyed their own government?
Just because Mogadishu has been captured doesn't mean the African Union just has to lay down their arms. They can still defend the capital, or rather not the capital, but the provisional capital of this one.
Okay. Congratulations again.
Hey everyone, I'm Waleed Hader. I should be your third speaker today. And I've got my slip of destiny right here. If it's good with my judges, I'll just read it out to everyone. China establishes a naval blockade around Taiwan, shutting off access to food and energy. How will Trump respond? Yeah. China establishes a naval blockade around Taiwan, shutting off access to food and energy. How will Trump respond? Would any of you all like my question? Yeah.
We're giving 5 down 30.
Awesome. And just any of my judges let me know if you need an extra set. Okay.
During one of his last campaign rallies, Donald Trump warned that millions of Chinese immigrants in the United States were secretly plotting to overthrow our democracy. And that's really, really bad because it's a copyright violation. Overthrowing democracy is Trump's thing. As the Global Taiwan Institute explains in an article published on November 13th of 2024, although Trump has long had a frosty relationship with China, one country that's been looking to that with a lot of unease has been Taiwan, a small island nation that's been facing Chinese threats that have only increased over recent decades. Although Donald Trump's first presidency was marked by a lot of support for Taiwan, he's now shifted toward a more America first and aggressively nationalistic policy, raising fears that the Chinese government either attacks Taiwan or more likely use a zone of hybrid warfare to create a crisis in the Taiwan America's support would at best be flaky and ineffective. So considering the Chinese violations of Taiwan's air defense identification zone that protects the sovereignty of that island have only been increasing over the last 5 years, today's scenario is seeming less and less like a hypothetical, making it imperative that we act. China imposes a naval blockade around the Taiwan Strait, cutting off access to food and energy. How will Trump respond? Honestly, the answer is that he's going to respond selfishly, because he's going to respond in a way that prioritizes his short-term interests before protecting Taiwanese sovereignty. More specifically, first, by leveraging the crisis to extract economic concessions from Taiwan. Second, by trying to sell Taiwan military equipment. And finally, by trying to sell out Taiwan to China. But first, in Donald Trump's book, The Art of the Deal, he said that he doesn't tell any lies, but instead just perfectly represents things. That is lying! And that's going to cost our allies. So the first reason why Trump is going to respond in an ineffective and self-interested way to a Taiwan Strait crisis is that we're going to see him try and sell, or rather leverage the crisis in order to gain more Taiwanese economic concessions. As Richard Bush, the senior fellow for Asia policy at the Brookings Institution, explains in an article published on October 8th of 2024, to the credit of the Trump administration in 2016, he actually did increase naval patrols by the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet around the Taiwan Strait. Having the ability of the U.S. Navy to actually be there in the event of a crisis is imperative, because that determines whether the United States will show that they're willing to intervene. But the issue with the new Trump administration is that their pattern of intervention is completely selfish and self-interested. Political Europe continued on February 15th of 2025. Donald Trump recently sent his Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, to Ukraine, where he demanded 50% of the country's rare earth mineral reserves worth $500 billion in exchange for continual military support. In Taiwan, where the country produces more than 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors, it's likely that Trump might offer support to the country, but also demand a stake in that $850 billion Taiwanese company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Doing so, Donald Trump may or may not provide Taiwan support in the short term, but will inevitably show in the long term that he's only interested in himself instead of our allies. But second, it's kind of important to recognize that Trump is very, very, very incompetent. Something that's going to hurt our response to this crisis because of his short-sightedness. The second way that Trump will respond to a crisis in the Taiwan Strait is by trying to sell military equipment to Taiwan. As the Taiwan Times explains in an article published on September 12th of 2024, one of the main ways that Taiwan would have to resist a naval blockade is through the air. But one of the main issues with responding to that naval blockade, which is the scenario being posed today, is that the Taiwan military only has 20 C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, which it would need to fly equipment, energy, and food into the island. But Donald Trump's specific approach to selling military equipment to Taiwan will leave them high and dry. The Cato Institute continues on December 13th of 2024 that in Trump's first administration, he never provided direct military aid to Taiwan, instead commissioning 11 arms sales to the country. But because the way America's military works is that direct military aid comes out of our stockpiles, where arms sales are future production, 75% of what Trump sold Taiwan in 2017 still hasn't even arrived. In a crisis over the Taiwan Strait, where thousands of people will be left starving, Donald Trump's just going to try and make a quick buck selling out the Taiwanese people. But finally, this issue goes way farther, because Donald Trump's willing to give up the entire sovereignty of countries as well. The third way Trump will respond to a crisis in the Taiwan Strait is by trying to sell Taiwan out to China outright. As an article published by the Council on Foreign Relations explained on December 12th of 2023, during the first Trump administration, Donald Trump was outward about the fact that his support for countries like Taiwan was transactional. Although he was very much supportive of things like providing reconnaissance and other military equipment and help that would make Taiwan hard to invade, he directly said that he was also willing to negotiate with China. And this is something that's more relevant today than ever before. Because as another article published by the Taipei Times explains on February 6th of 2025, Donald Trump is currently in a trade war with China. And the last time Trump was in a trade war with China, he also tried to use the Taiwan Strait just as a way to extract concessions, cutting off contact with Taiwan in exchange for trade deal concessions. At a time when the Taiwanese people are in a state of distress, without food or energy, Donald Trump will probably pick up the phone and call Xi Jinping, selling out our allies just for the sake of his own trade interests. When Americans elected Donald Trump to the presidency, they didn't just roll the dice on the future of our democracy, but on the future of the entire world. We're in the endgame now. So upon returning to the hypothetical, China imposes a naval blockade on Taiwan, shutting off access to food and energy. How will Trump respond? The answer is clear. He's going to respond selfishly. More specifically, first, by leveraging the crisis to extract economic concessions from Taiwan. Second, by trying to sell Taiwan military equipment ineffectively. And finally, by offering to sell out Taiwanese sovereignty. So, although Donald Trump might be getting a little bit upset that China's copying his strategy of selling out democracy, it's pretty clear that crises around the world are only providing him more opportunities to try out his favorite thing to do. We're actually allies. Taiwan. May I ask what signals will we do?
Yeah, just 2 or 3 seconds.
Really like your outfit. You could say that Taiwan. I actually like to start with your third point. Essentially, you claim that Trump's short-term interests of trade will supersede, for example, our military interests in the region. But is maintaining military supremacy also not a major short-term interest? Because if that's lost, that would be pretty disastrous.
I think you're missing Donald Trump's pretty well-documented ability to contradict himself. So the issue is that specifically across Asia, Donald Trump wants the military to be present and dominant, but he's only ever used that military dominance in order to extract economic concessions, both from our allies and adversaries. I think this is a pretty important broader discussion that we have to have, because Trump likes to fashion himself as the alpha male aggressive president, but he's actually really, really weak. The fact of the matter is that Donald Trump tries to become very militarily aggressive, but he never actually uses that to defend our allies or defend their sovereignty without having some sort of short-term interest that goes along with it.
So is military supremacy not an interest in both the short term and the long term?
Military supremacy is an interest, but only for the sake of the economic concessions, which I've shown empirically that Donald Trump ultimately prioritizes.
Okay, let's go to your first point. You claim that Donald Trump would essentially demand a stake in Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company. But isn't TSMC already building several factories in the state of Arizona, meaning that the U.S. already has a stake?
Again, Donald Trump is really, really greedy. So what we saw with Ukraine is that they offered that in exchange for NATO membership, we would have some control and some mining inside of their rare earth mineral sector. But the issue is that Donald Trump, as somebody who is providing military aid to Ukraine, saw more leverage that he could take because of the crisis in that country. Because of the fact that Taiwan is facing a newfound crisis, Donald Trump is going to use that leverage to get outright ownership. It's important to note that Trump has a unique interest in ownership. He demanded a 50% stake in TikTok recently, and has been trying to get direct control over Ukraine's minerals, showing that he doesn't just want to buy Ukraine's minerals and regulate TikTok.
Here's the
He
thing
wants
about the
control.
Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing facility. Its fabs, which manufacture semiconductors, are designed to self-destruct in the event of a Chinese invasion. Wouldn't this essentially collapse their semiconductor industry if Trump doesn't immediately rush to their military aid?
It would collapse their military industry if
So
there was a
how does
straight.
it first-
This is not a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. This hypothetical is about a naval blockade. And the thing about a naval blockade is that Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing companies fabs are also designed to function without energy, like we saw during earthquakes that happened in Taiwan a couple of years ago. So when we look at the specific situation that Taiwan is facing, Donald Trump's unfortunately going to see it as an avenue to pursue his
Alright, I'm
own
sorry, we have 30
self-interest
seconds
and
left,
take
so
off
I have
the
to ask my
TSMC.
final question. Your third point essentially suggests that Trump will sell Taiwan out to China, but your first point suggests that he will extract
seems that ultimately, Trump is going to respond selfishly.
Go GK 1000, Anthony Baldwin. My question is, Elon Musk decides that trains are, quote, woke. Doge announces that it's suspending all government funding to Amtrak. What can be done to preserve American rail? Again, Elon Musk decides that trains are, quote, woke, and Doge announces that it's suspending all government funding to Amtrak. What can be done to preserve American rail? Do any of the judges want my question? Please. And if my judges are okay with timing myself, I will need any times. Ready? With regards to American population decline, Donald Trump said that he wants Americans to create more, quote, beautiful American babies. I imagine he probably brought on Elon Musk to the administration, like, solely for that purpose. I mean, honestly, with the amount of time that Donald Trump and Elon Musk have been spending together recently, they're probably experts in making American babies together. When Elon Musk isn't procreating with Donald Trump, he's creating problems within the American government. This is the ENO Center for Transportation, a nonprofit research group, explains on January 17th of this year, Elon Musk's Department of Governmental Efficiency, or DOGE, has made a promise to trim $2 trillion off of the American federal governmental budget. Unfortunately, this puts Amtrak, the Federal Railway Authority, directly within Elon Musk's line of fire, because it's already bleeding billions of dollars in revenue and losing money every single year. So when considering that American trains aren't just crucial to connecting the country, they're crucial to protecting our environment, we have to ask the hypothetical. Elon Musk decides that trains are, quote, woke, and DOGE announces it's cutting all federal funding for Amtrak. How can we preserve American rail? The answer is to adopt comprehensive solutions at all steps of the railway process. Specifically, first, states can still increase funding for their own transportation authorities. Second, cities can adopt congestion pricing. And finally, Amtrak should redirect funding to high-speed rail in high-demand locations. But first, it's been roughly 1 year since Elon Musk launched himself into space and unfortunately returned. But even though federal funding might be coming back down to earth, state funding can still go upwards to the stars. And that's exactly the first way we can preserve American rail. States can still increase funding for their own transportation authorities. Because as the scholarly Institute for Transportation and Development Policy explains on January 24th of last year, the American railway system's problems don't just lie within Amtrak, the federal railway system, they also rely on individual state transportation systems that are bleeding billions of dollars every single year as a result of chronic underfunding in cities like New York City, for example. And even though they're lacking funding in the status quo, that doesn't mean states don't have solutions. The New York University School of Law advocates for, on October 24th of last year, more and more states can adopt the approach of Massachusetts, which taxed higher income brackets marginally and put the resulting profits back into the transportation system, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority, or MBTA. Just since they started this approach under Governor Maura Healey in July of 2023, ridership has increased on the Massachusetts commuter rail by 55%. That creates profits and new consumers that can preserve American rail. To protect the underground, we have to start from ground roots efforts. States have to be the one to respond in the absence of the federal government. But the second way we can still preserve American rail is by adopting congestion pricing. Because as the Business Insider polled Americans and discovered on February 28th of last year, a pricing can come in. NBC New York quantifies on January 29th of this year, after New York City adopted congestion pricing, or charging cars extra for utilizing the roads during busy hours, they were able to increase ridership on the New York City subway by 12.2%, deriving new millions of dollars of revenue that can offset the outlays that it's producing every single year. Moreover, this isn't just critical to increasing ridership to preserve American rail in the absence of federal funding. It's key to American public health. As the New York State Congress concludes on February 4th of this year, after the adoption of congestion pricing, traffic accidents were reduced by 55%. That saves lives. But the third and final way that Amtrak can preserve itself in the absence of federal funding, and the American rail system as a whole, is, third and finally, redirecting funding to high-speed rail in high-demand locations. Amtrak itself quantifies on January 29th of last year that Amtrak is slow. Most of its trains can only go about 80 miles an hour, which means that when trying to commute between major cities like Boston, New York City, or Washington, D.C., taking a car or plane is often magnitudes faster than using Amtrak, whilst often still operating at a comparable price, meaning Amtrak isn't getting the revenue from valuable potential consumers. Yet even in the absence of federal funding, there are still ways it can use its remaining funding from other locations to gain new ridership. Particularly, The Guardian illustrates on July 24th of last year. Currently, Amtrak uses the new funding it receives to build out into new locations, like rural areas. But the reality is that the low demand of those locations is simply not enough to offset the costs of building out there. So therefore, using its remaining funding from ridership and nonprofit grants, Amtrak should redirect funding into higher speed rail at high demand locations between major American cities. This way, the tens of thousands of consumers Amtrak is losing every single year taking their cars and planes instead of the trains are more likely to commute using Amtrak, meaning even in the absence of federal funding, Amtrak can gain the revenues that it was previously losing out on. Currently, Amtrak is falling under, but using new systems can keep its head above ground. So when considering that car ownership is practically a barrier to entry in American society, we have to answer the question. Elon Musk announces that trains are woke, and Doge announces it's cutting all federal funding from Amtrak. How can the American rail system be preserved? The answer is that we have to adopt comprehensive solutions at all steps of the railway system, whether it's through increased state funding, congestion pricing, or redirected Amtrak funding. It's clear that while Elon Musk and Donald Trump might be busy procreating, Amtrak can create some simple solutions to keep its head above water.
That has been an amazing speech. It certainly did not go off the rails. Just to confirm, time to go. 1, 2. So I want to start off with your first point about increased state funding. Given that the nature of this question has to do with preserving American rail, would most increased state funding just lead to intrastate transportation, which is not the initial purpose of Amtrak?
American rail doesn't just comprise Amtrak, it comprises rail at both the state and federal level.
But isn't this question about responding to the cutoff in Amtrak funding?
Right, and even if American rail suffers at the federal level, it can still improve at the state level to compensate for Americans' lost efforts of transportation through Amtrak.
Isn't it true that across the Pacific routes for Amtrak, where California tried a state-level rail system, it was several times more expensive because of government inefficiency and corruption at a state level?
That's
How do
exactly
we
the
make sure
inefficiency that my point aims to get rid of. I specifically proposed Massachusetts' solution of taxing higher income brackets where that corruption you speak of often resides, so that Americans can have, or rather the government can create new funding that can pump into the transportation system to make it more efficient.
Okay, let's move on to your second point that has to do with city congestion pricing. Once again, this will lead to an increase in subway usage. But isn't it true that across states where the Amtrak is an overground interstate rail system, we're still not going to be able to fund and increase ridership on railways?
Right, this is the same answer to your first question, right? The American rail system doesn't just comprise Amtrak across all state and federal levels, be it through the subway or above-ground rail transportation. So even if Amtrak suffers at my very, very lowest ground, adopting congestion pricing solutions will still make sure that other forms of railway systems can
But
still
how will we preserve the financial viability of the railway system if your proposed solution doesn't actually increase ridership on the railways that are no longer being funded?
Sure, this goes back to my third point. Even in the absence of federal funding, Amtrak still makes money from ridership and nonprofit grants. That's why I propose they can increase ridership by speeding up their railway systems at the areas in which there is the highest per
Let's
person
talk
demand.
high-speed rail because it's becoming a bit PFE. But when we look at the high-speed rail system that Amtrak has been trying to build in Brightline as well as Florida, isn't it true that the new technological cost overruns of implementing high-speed rail have actually driven ticket prices up and the inherent profitability down? How is this not going to worsen rail instead of preserving it?
Exactly, because as I specifically explained in my source from The Guardian, when Amtrak gets new funding, it primarily concentrates it into building outwards towards new locations rather than redirecting it entirely into the high-demand areas where Amtrak can actually make its money back.
Isn't that about creating or rather maintaining existing rural railways that are some of the only ways for rural America to connect with urban centers? How are you going to preserve American rail if you're taking it away from the rural communities that need it most?
I am more than willing to concede that under this solution, some Americans who would have had access to transportation wouldn't have it anymore. But the reality is that for anyone to have any transportation at all, Amtrak has to make money somehow. That's why my solution is so important.
All right.
Hi, my name is Anisha Gupta. I should be your next speaker. Yeah, I have a hand as to the justice. Perfect. And I will just get the questions. It is, like many other governments in the Lake Chad Basin in the last few years, the Nigerian government is toppled in a coup. How should Boko Haram best take advantage of the situation to consolidate power? Like many of the governments in the Lake Chad Basin in the last few years, the Nigerian government is toppled in a military coup. How should Boko Haram best take advantage of this situation to consolidate power?
Giving time signal 5 down, so it's 7.
Perfect. That's it. And if I just have a thumbs up from all of my lips to the right. Three-year-old Aisha has nothing but a thin mattress and her mother to survive in Niger. Unfortunately, because of increased attacks from terrorist group Boko Haram and a lack of water and food, she was killed this past November. Although she isn't the first to die in this crisis, unfortunately, she may not be the last. As Eurasia News explains, on July 6th of last year, after a series of economic, social, and political crises in the Lake Chad Basin, it is in its worst state since 1970. The terrorist group of Boko Haram has been active in Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, as well as Chad, and has displaced over 350,000 citizens in the area, fighting against both civilian militias and the Nigerian government to take power. However, now it is in its weakest position yet, which is why, for the sake of citizens just like Aisha, we must ask the question and consider the hypothetical situation. Like many governments in the Lake Chad Basin in the last few years, the Nigerian government is toppled in a coup. How should Boko Haram best take advantage of the situation to consolidate power? The answer is simple. They must improve their previous operations, shown in 3 key ways. First, they must detract from the military. Second, they must stop targeting civilians. Before finally, regrouping with the ISWAP. It seems that
security checks within their own communities to protect themselves first, meaning that Boko Haram has lost miles of territory because civilians are fighting against them. In the case the government is toppled, Boko Haram must look to the future in understanding not how it can consolidate power now, but keep it even if the Nigerian government does come back. As the Nigerian Times explains, a local Nigerian newspaper on January 17th of last year, it seems that by siding with civilians, Boko Haram should stop targeting civilians in infrastructure attacks, and instead to work with gaining some sort of influence over them. This would ensure they have people on their side in the event that the Nigerian government does reform, and ensures that the spark of civilian militias is put out immediately, prioritizing the terrorist group now, but also in the future. But third and finally, Boko Haram won't be the only terrorist group trying to take over Nigeria in the event of a military coup. The military group ISWAP will try to as well, meaning the third and final step that Boko Haram can take to consolidate power in this situation is regrouping with the ISWAP. As the Brookings Institution explained last year, the ISWAP is actually a splintered faction from Boko Haram. Because of different ideologies, as well as different strategies on how to deal with military forces, the groups ended up splitting, which has unfortunately led to destruction in the country. As the MSP explained just 1 hour ago, there seems to be military engagements between the two groups. Just 3 days ago in the region of Guinea in Niger, the two groups fought, leading to the deaths of thousands of fighters and the loss of tons of resources, making it clear that the ISWAP is the competitor for the Nigerian government. However, if Boko Haram were to try and regroup with the ISWAP, it would be a better option than trying to fight them in order to gain control of the government. Putting ideologies to the side, both Boko Haram and the ISWAP want control. If having it together means that they can have it, they certainly will take that action now. So it's when returning to this hypothetical situation. Local governments within the Lake Chad Basin in the past few years have been experiencing instability, meaning that in the scenario that the Nigerian government is toppled in a coup, we must ask, how should Boko Haram best take advantage of the situation and consolidating power? The answer is quite simple. They must review and improve on pre-existing operations by first, detracting from the military, second, siding with civilians, before finally regrouping with the ISWAP. Although Boko Haram is a terrorist organization that is responsible for the deaths of citizens like Aisha, this situation grants them an opportunity to gain power, one that they surely will take advantage of when the odds are against them.
Congrats on a great speech. Just a couple questions. Let's start directly on your first point about detracting from the military. You proposed a variety of solutions under this point. Can you just specifically delineate real quick what you want Boko Haram to actually do under your first point?
Sure. I talked about the fact that their military services are being countered by climate aggression now. It seems that the area in which they attacked, Niger, has specific wind conditions and heat conditions that end up deteriorating their military forces.
Right.
By diverting funding to creating solutions that can perhaps protect their forces or even establishing new equipment, Boko Haram will be able to better pose themselves against climate threat
Okay.
and improve military.
But we're talking about overthrowing the Nigerian military government. Why does climate aggression in Niger remotely matter to Boko Haram?
Because climate change ends up deteriorating their military forces. We know that Boko Haram has a military advantage today. In a situation in which the Nigerian government only has the military to fight against them, the small differences of things like climate, how operations are used, and specific targets, like I mentioned in my speech, will make all the difference in Boko Haram consolidating power today.
Okay, but under your first point about detracting from the military, you also proposed attacking children to make raids more effective. Doesn't this directly contradict your second point where you state Boko Haram should stop attacking civilians?
I'm talking about detracting from the magnitude of military operations, not necessarily how military operations work. It seems the idea of proposing soft targets, meaning putting children and women in distress to gain power in raids, would be a better opportunity for Boko Haram. Rather than diverting funding and resources being attacked in this scenario and are forming their own militias, like I mentioned in my speech. Although there might be an incentive to side with Boko Haram, they are an insurgent terrorist group. Civilians aren't going to be reassured by joining the group that they will suddenly be immune from military violence, making it clear that civilian militias must be siding with Boko Haram by Boko Haram having a sense of mutual respect.
On your third point then about allying with other paramilitias in Nigeria, Boko Haram is by far the most powerful military organization in Nigeria, other than the Nigerian government. What incentive do they have to ally with other paramilitias across the country when they can likely simply take over the Nigerian government without having to form alliances with other parties?
Well, actually, my speech mentions the fact that they
now, they're using that to form extremely powerful alliances. For example, with countries like Kenya, where they're providing nearly $80 million in aid for military spending. Not only that, but they've also done this in Asian countries like Vietnam, allowing them to establish global influence. The problem is that they also did this with Ukraine. And in 1994, Ukraine gave up their nuclear arms because the United States said they would protect them. However, according to this hypothetical, they were unsuccessful because Russia came out on top. As explained by Center for Strategic and International Studies article published just 3 days ago. Considering this pattern, it's likely that other countries dependent on the U.S. are going to have to reevaluate if they want to truly be safe. So, when returning to today's hypothetical, China brokers a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, ending the war on terms favorable to Moscow. What impact will this have on America's global influence? The obvious answer is it's going to significantly decrease it. Something we saw in 3 key areas. First, through the Eastern European states. Next, through problems over BRICS. And finally, through issues of states dependent on Europe. So, while China might be scared of winning the bill, it's obvious that they do not need to be scared of the United States.
Great speech, Charlotte. I just have a few questions. At the beginning, you mentioned how the United States' ego and pockets would be hurt. Who's to say they won't intervene and try to change the negotiations of this peace deal?
Despite the fact that they might be able to change the negotiations, the question clearly states that China was the primary broker of it. And in this deal, they were able to help Moscow get more of Ukraine's resources. So because of the way the hypothetical is phrased, it's obvious that the United States did not play a significant stake in
But
it.
if they didn't play a significant stake in the state of the hypothetical, who's to say that the U.S. won't engage with a hypothetical in trying to restate the peace broker deal?
While the United States could do this, that's an entirely hypothetical scenario, and we're already dealing with a hypothetical given to us. So that's pretty much irrelevant to the question.
Let's move to your first point about Eastern European allies. Who's to say that countries like Armenia and Slovenia won't necessarily join the European Union? It's a big alliance with over 20 countries. Why would they side with Russia if they have 20 countries in the Union?
So a lot of these countries have been trying to join the EU, but they still haven't been accepted into the European Union. So it's highly likely that considering the massive threat that Russia is playing at the moment, they're going to try to seek some sort of alliance in any way.
So you're saying Armenia and Slovenia will sacrifice their only opportunity to join the European Union because Russia has gained power through this deal?
I'm not stating that they're going to sacrifice the opportunity. The EU obviously doesn't want them, considering a lot of them have been on the waiting list for decades. And at some point, they're going to get bored of this, especially because there's an immediate threat.
Do you know if any EU membership countries are immediately granted access to the alliance?
They are not.
Moving on to your second point. It seems that the BRICS alliance is taking more power. The BRICS alliance has recently emerged, however, and isn't nearly as strong as the G7. Who's to say that dysfunction will still attract member countries from joining?
What I'm arguing in this question is that it will give more power to BRICS, taking power away from NATO and U.S. allies. Ultimately, because of that, the United States is going to lose global
But
influence.
since BRICS is a politically dysfunctional group that has recently emerged, why would allies want to side with BRICS or join BRICS in the case of this hypothetical?
BRICS might be politically dysfunctional, but it also is one of the most economically important groups, considering, as I stated, it makes up 37% of global GDP. And it can also promise a lot of allies in the future for people who join.
But if the countries include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, do they exclusively provide trade through BRICS?
They don't exclusively provide trade through BRICS. There's also countries that aren't listed in the title of the organization. For example, countries like Turkey, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia that are all part of it, ultimately allowing for an interconnected alliance of any country that gets involved.
Speaking of Turkey, you mentioned how they're balancing an alliance with BRICS as well as